Hi, and welcome to Crash Course Catholicism, a podcast about Catholic teaching and why it makes sense. I'm your host, Caitlin West. Hey friends, welcome to episode 74. So, you might remember that at the end of the last episode, I said that we were going to talk about Eucharistic miracles. However, in the meantime, Pope Francis has just announced that a young man called Blessed Carlo Acutis, who died in the early 2000s, a young Italian teenager, is going to be canonized. This is super exciting because Carlo Acutis is going to be the first millennial saint. I'm so excited. But he also is really well known for having a deep love for the Eucharist and for promoting Eucharistic miracles, in part through a website that he created. So when I heard this news, I was like, oh my gosh, perfect. This is amazing. We're going to start with a biography of Blessed Carlo Acutis. And then in the next episode, we're going to talk about some examples of Eucharistic miracles, some of which will be taken from the website that he developed. So I'm super excited for this episode and for the next one. Tell you what, guys, I didn't know much about Carlo Acutis, but when I started researching for this episode, I am now like a mega fan. He was so cool. And one of the most exciting things about him is how contemporary he was. First of all, just literally, he was born in the 90s. Like, if he was still alive today, he would be 1 year older than me. That is how contemporary he is. But secondly, when you read about his life, he just feels like now, because it is, like it's so relatable, which is so helpful because sometimes when you read the lives of the saints, even 20th century saints, but especially when you read the lives of older saints like St. Francis of Assisi or St. Therese of Lisieux, they're beautiful and very inspiring, but it can feel a bit sort of far off and a bit like, oh yeah, well that was back then and this is now. Whereas with Blessed Carlo, it's like, you know, he's a saint, but his story involves like Nutella and the internet and PlayStations. It's very now, which is really, really cool because it makes it feel so much more tangible and realistic and like, yeah, this is what I'm called to as well. I'm called to be a saint in the contemporary world. So let's talk about the life of Blessed Carlo Acutis. So Carlo was born in the year 1991. He was actually born in London because his parents were travelling for work at the time, but his parents were both Italian and they soon after moved back to Italy. Carlo was born to parents who were actually not practicing Catholics. I mean, they were Italian, so they were like cultural Catholics, but they weren't practicing and they really didn't know much about their faith at all. So his mum talks about this. She talks about how the first mass that she ever went to was her first Holy Communion. And then the second mass that she ever went to was her confirmation. And then the third mass that she ever went to was her wedding. So she was like, I really didn't know anything about my faith. I was very, very much not educated in it. So they didn't bring Carlo up at first practicing Catholic. However, Carlo seemed to have from a very young age this almost infused love for God and knowledge of God. So when he was a toddler, he and his mum would go for walks, and if they ever walked past a Catholic church, he would be like, let's go inside. He wanted to go in, and he would want to just sit in front of the tabernacle or sit in front of the cross, to the point where his mum would be like, okay, Carlo, like it's time to go, and he'd be like, no, let's just stay for a little while longer. So he had this really deep love for God, and it wasn't clear where this knowledge of God and love for God came from. He was kind of raised in part by nannies. He had Irish and Polish nannies, so he would have picked up some stuff from them and also from going to Catholic schools, etc. However, a lot of the time when you read his biography, there are all these stories about how he was often the one inspiring his nannies to love God more and to go to church more. So there's actually this very cute anecdote about how when Carlo was very little, I think he was about 5 or 6, he used to go on holidays to the south of Italy and he would spend the day like playing at the beach with all the other kids, but he would also show up at the local church with all like the little old Italian ladies to say the rosary with them and to be there for mass. And they would be like, what is with this little like 5-year-old at church? And he apparently really influenced all of the little old ladies because he was so recollected and attentive that they would sort of pay more attention and they would stop sort of chatting during mass and really kind of pray more deeply because Carlo was there setting an example at the age of like 5. Anyway, so Carlo seemed to really just love God and want to be close to God. And he started asking his mum questions about his faith. And his mum obviously didn't have any of the answers because she'd had no formation. But she was so struck and so moved by his love for God that she decided that it was time for her to go back to church. So she and her husband, both of them, returned to the sacraments, and his mum started receiving catechism lessons. And so did Carlo, because he would go along with her. So Carlo, by the age of 7, he was ready to receive his first Holy Communion. And from that point onwards, Carlo never missed daily mass. From the age of 7, he would go to mass every single day, and he would often stay afterwards for adoration. He would also pray the rosary every single day, and he used to go to confession once a week, which, when we hear about people going to confession really regularly, we can think that, it's some sort of guilt thing, like this person has a scrupulous kind of conscience or whatever. No, that wasn't the case at all. Carlo actually had a really healthy attitude towards confession. So there's this great quote from him where he says, "Asking for forgiveness and being reconciled with God is like rekindling the fire of your hot air balloon and discarding the stones that are weighing your basket down." I love that image because he's putting the emphasis on the power of the sacraments to propel us towards heaven. And this was very clear in Carlo from a young age. It was like he had gotten a running start on his journey to heaven. He was just sprinting from a very young age. So, Carlo was also just a very normal, happy-go-lucky, friendly young boy. He had lots of friends. He loved playing soccer. Apparently, he wasn't very good at it. His mum talks about this. She's like, he was not a very good soccer player, but he really liked it and he had a lot of fun. So he liked playing soccer. He liked hanging out with his friends. He liked playing video games. He was very normal. One of the notable things about Carlo was how friendly he was and how much he enjoyed being around other people. Probably this had a little bit to do with the fact that he was often quite isolated because he was an only child until his death. His parents had twins after he died. But when he was alive, he didn't have any siblings and his parents both worked full time. So he was often looked after by nannies. So Carlo had this real hunger to just be around people. He loved making friends and he was super friendly. And the beautiful thing was that he often seemed almost unaware of things like social status and hierarchies and class and things like that. He just treated everyone exactly the same. So when Carlo first started school at the age of about 5 or 6, he would walk to school every morning with his nanny. And as he walked to school, he would always stop at each of the apartment buildings that he passed and say good morning to the caretaker. And not only would he say good morning, but he got to know each of them by name and he would stop for a chat with them. And one of the caretakers commented on this. He said, "It was actually very unusual for a boy like that to stop and chat with someone like me, let alone to know my name and take a personal interest in me." Because Carlo was from quite a well-to-do family, he was quite privileged, so it was unusual. Carlo's family also employed a man named Rajesh, who kind of looked after the daily running of the household. And Carlo, again, took a personal interest in him and became his friend. He used to sit with him to have meals and just chat to him about life and get to know him and ask questions about his home back in India and just developed this really natural friendship with him. And in the process of this friendship, Carlo started sharing with his friend about his own faith, and he would just talk to him about God. At one point, he brought the Bible out and was telling him about the Bible. At another point, he brought the catechism out. They started talking through the catechism, and he was kind of giving this guy, this grown man, Rajesh, catechism classes. And eventually, Rajesh was like, "Hey, I want to get baptized." And then Rajesh introduced Carlo to a friend of his, and then the friend got baptized as well. So even as a child, Carlo had this very apostolic spirit. Carlo's love for people and for friendship also extended, obviously, to his school friends. So Carlo apparently always had an eye out for the person who was a little bit on the outer or a little bit shy or struggling a bit. Apparently, anytime someone was being bullied or teased, Carlo would walk over, take that person by the hand and be like, "Come on, come play with me." And then he'd take him off and they'd hang out together. One really cool anecdote that I read in his biography was that some of Carlo's friends were a little bit in the habit of making inappropriate comments to some of the girls in his class, or they would try to wolf whistle them or say things that, were a bit on the nose. And Carlo would always call them out on it. He'd be like, hey, guys, come on. We're not animals. Like, this isn't funny. It's not cool. Don't speak to women in that way. I read that and I was like, yes, you go, Glen Coco. There were some other stories that I read about Carlo inviting his friends over after school. So in one instance, he had two friends who had had a falling out. So Carlo invited them back to his place after school to try to like mediate and get them to be friends again. Another time, he had these two friends who were brothers and their parents were going through a separation. So Carlo would invite them over after school to kind of distract them because he knew that their home life was a bit tough. So Carlo had plenty of friends at school. He was very well respected in his social group. However, one notable thing about him that kind of set him apart was that he wasn't really concerned with being cool. In particular, he really didn't care about having like the latest brands and the fanciest clothes. Now, he could have cared about this because his parents were quite wealthy, so they could have afforded to buy him all of the latest stuff. But Carlo very deliberately tried to avoid a kind of consumeristic attitude. In fact, his mum talks about how there were times when she would try to buy him like a second pair of shoes and he would get really upset. He'd be like, I don't need 2 pairs of shoes. I only need 1. This is money that we could give to the poor. And so when you see photos of Carlo, like he looked normal. He looked just like everyone else. It's not like he was wearing sackcloth and ashes. He fit in, he looked fashionable, he looked fine, but he wasn't obsessed with like having the latest Nike sneakers or whatever. Another area where Carlo showed a kind of detachment from status was in the area of academics. Apparently a lot of his school friends were really obsessed with being number one, and there was a lot of academic kind of competition in his classes. And Carlo actually could very easily have been top of his class in most things. Carlo's mum actually talks about how Carlo was highly intelligent. He started talking at a very young age. He was reading and writing at the age of 4. Apparently when he was 9, he was reading university level textbooks on computer coding and like taught himself how to do coding. So he was super intelligent. And actually one of his school friends who used to do homework with him after school used to talk to him about this. She'd be like, Carlo, why don't you try harder to be number 1 at school? You could top most of your classes. Why are you content with being just like a slightly above average student? And Carlo said that there were essentially 2 reasons. First of all, because there were many other important things in his life. Carlo had a really wide range of hobbies. For instance, as we've kind of mentioned, he really loved computer coding. He taught himself how to play saxophone. He was also involved in volunteering, doing stuff for his parish, going to mass every day, praying. He did so many things in his life that he was like, I don't want to spend 100% of my time obsessing over getting top marks when I can just do well at school. And this is the thing, it's not like Carlo slackened off in his work. He worked really hard, he was a diligent student, he got good marks, but he just wasn't obsessed with getting the best possible marks to the detriment of other important things in his life. The second reason why he wasn't obsessed with being number 1 was because he was more interested in helping the students who were struggling in his class. So rather than spending hours and hours studying, he would spend that time helping out the kids who were failing and making sure that they could also keep up. So he had this really healthy balance where he worked hard, he didn't slacken off, he wasn't lazy with his schoolwork, he tried to do the best that he could, but he also gave time to other important things that mattered. By the way, side note, that friend of Carlo's that was trying to convince him that he should spend more time trying to be top of the class, instead of her convincing him, he ended up convincing her that there were other things more important in life, and she eventually made the decision to start practicing her faith again because of him. Isn't that cool? One other notable element of Carlo's personality was his love for nature and for animals. Carlo had a special devotion to St. Francis of Assisi, and like St. Francis, he had a deep love for nature. So whenever he went out walking, he would always pick up any rubbish that he found on the ground. And he did this so often that his dad eventually bought him one of those like long stick claw things that you can use to pick up rubbish to help him. He also had a bunch of pets. He had 2 cats, 4 dogs, and like a bajillion fish. And apparently every time he saw a stray animal, he would ask his parents if they could adopt it. Okay, so we've talked a lot about Carlo's virtues and the things that really made him stand out. And at this point, we might be thinking, oh my gosh, this guy, he was like perfect. He's like a perfect child. Well, no, Carlo, just like everyone, had his own struggles. One particular area where Carlo struggled was in the virtue of temperance. So temperance is the virtue that helps you to stop when you've had enough of something. So Carlo had a particular love for Nutella. And sometimes he would go to the pantry, steal the Nutella jar and grab a spoon and then just like eat it straight out of the jar. Now, eating Nutella straight out of the jar with a spoon is, let's be real, one of life's great joys and something that we should all indulge in from time to time. However, Carlo sometimes tended to overindulge in Nutella in particular. So this became an area of struggle for him. And actually, like all of our areas of struggle, when we work at them, it became a place of growth in virtue. So Carlo would often give up Nutella for Lent. And he worked really, really hard at not overindulging. And his mum said that she noticed this in him, that he was able to find a way to really enjoy the things that he loved, eventually, without overindulging in them. Another area where he struggled a bit with temperance was in playing video games. So Carlo had a gaming console. It wasn't clear what, like it didn't say in the biography which kind it was. I assume he had a PlayStation. And he really enjoyed playing it, like every young person. But his parents were very aware of the possibility of like gaming addiction, and they didn't want him to spend too much time gaming. So they set a limit. They said, you're only allowed to play games for 2 hours a week. Now, 2 hours a week would not have felt like a lot of time for a young boy. So there were times where this became a point of conflict at home. Carlo would ask if he could play more games, if he could play for longer, and his parents would have to say, no, you can't. And it was a bit of a point of tension at home until one day when Carlo invited all of his friends over to play video games. Now, Carlo's friends were a lot more addicted to their gaming consoles than he was because they didn't have the same limits as him. And Carlo watched as all of these friends went from being like happy-go-lucky, bantering young boys to suddenly being locked in on this video game, and they were all like shouting at each other and getting really competitive and getting super upset when they lost and boasting and like just all of these really awful behaviors. And by the time they had to go home, like they didn't want to tear themselves away from the screen. They were all really upset, and it was really unattractive behavior. And Carlo was kind of watching all of this from the outside, and he had this moment of like, oh, that's what my parents are talking about. And he kind of got it. So from that point onwards, he became personally a lot more invested in his parents' rule about gaming, and he actually started trying to set limits on himself as well. Now, although Carlo tried to limit his gaming time, he still had this really deep enthusiasm for technology and computers. So we've already said that he was reading like coding textbooks at the age of 9, and he'd gotten really, really good at using computers. And he became fascinated by the idea of the power of technology to spread the gospel. So Carlo started using his coding and computer skills to do things like he created a website for his parish. He created another website that was promoting youth volunteering work. He started creating these animations and comics that he could use as tools to teach catechism to the kids in his parish, because he'd actually been helping out with teaching catechism since he was about 11 years old. So he continued to use his love of technology and his skills with computers, but he used them to serve our Lord. Now, alongside his love of technology, Carlo also had a deep, profound love for our Lord in the Eucharist. Carlo was entranced by the knowledge that our Lord was really and truly present, body, blood, soul, and divinity in the Eucharist. This was like the great love of his life. He used to talk about it all the time. Like he would explain it to his friends. He would have these conversations where they'd go back through the Gospels and he'd like point to the different moments where God talks about this. He really wanted to convince them that, hey, when you go to Mass, God is really and truly there. And his friends noticed that when they went to Mass with him, Carlo wasn't like the other kids. He wasn't distracted and kind of wriggling around in his seat and looking around. He was totally recollected, listening really carefully, praying really deeply. And they were like, wow, he really believes that, God is really there. Carlo used to refer to the Eucharist as his highway to heaven. And he had this great analogy. He was like, when you go and stand in the sun, when you're in the presence of the sun for long enough, you develop a suntan. That's just naturally what happens. He was like, well, it's the same thing when you're in front of our Lord in the Eucharist. When you go to adoration, even just being there, you don't have to do anything. Just being in the presence of God, you are basking in the rays of his grace, and you will naturally become holier. Like you'll grow closer to him just because you're in his presence. Carlo was frustrated by the fact that so few people seemed to really understand that God was truly there when they went to Mass. He said to his mum, he was like, "It's so frustrating to me because you see these crowds of people lining up to go to concerts or lining up to go to football matches, but you don't see crowds of people lining up to go to communion, to go to Mass." He was like, if people knew, if people really understood that they were in the presence of God, like, can you imagine how it would change their lives? So this was one of the things that Carlo was really passionate about. And actually, when you hear his mum talking today, his mum often goes around and gives talks about her son. And this is always the thing that she dwells on. She's like, this is what my son taught me. I never understood the true presence of Christ in the Eucharist. And Carlo gave that to me. He showed me that our Lord is really there. And that knowledge has completely changed my life. So Carlo wanted to share that knowledge with as many people as possible. And he became really interested in researching Eucharistic miracles because he realized that this was a great way to help people grow in their faith in the true presence of Christ in the Eucharist, was through learning about Eucharistic miracles. So Carlo decided to put together an exhibition about all of the different church-approved Eucharistic miracles. Now, remember that this is in the very early days of the internet. So putting together an exhibition like this required not just Googling the information and compiling it. Carlo began to undertake painstaking research, and it took him 2.5 years to gather all of the information that he needed and to build this exhibition. In fact, Carlo and his parents used to travel to different parts of the world where these miracles had occurred to find the information, to pray in front of these miraculous hosts, etc. And at the end of 2.5 years, Carlo had put together this amazing exhibition with all of these beautiful graphics, really beautifully set out, that told the stories of different Eucharistic miracles across time and around the world. Now, this exhibition actually opened in the week that Carlo died. So we'll get to that later. But the amazing thing is that it is still touring today. This exhibition has been shown in over 10,000 parishes around the world. And in fact, anyone can have the exhibition at their parish. So that is worth doing if you have the time and capacity and you want to bring the exhibition to your parish, because it has helped countless people to really grow in their faith in the true presence of the Eucharist. Actually, I want to share something that happened to me today because this was crazy. Earlier today, I went to the cathedral in Brisbane because we had a Corpus Christi procession. And at the cathedral, they were showing this exhibition. I was like, no way, you're kidding me. So I went in and the exhibition was there. I got to see all of the different Eucharistic miracles. They had a first-class relic of Carlo Acutis. I got a prayer card. I was like, oh, this is awesome. Anyway, I can now personally vouch for how awesome this exhibition is. Alongside creating the exhibition, Carlo also built a website that has all of the same information about Eucharistic miracles. This website is still live today. I think it's probably been updated by people since then, but it's still live. It's still accessible. I'll put the link to it in the show notes, and we're actually going to use that website for our next episode. How cool is that? Okay. So we said earlier that the exhibition that Carlo had created opened the week that he died. So Carlo died at the age of 15, and he died very suddenly. It was super, super unexpected, and it happened very quickly. On the 1st of October, 2006, Carlo had just finished putting the final touches on his exhibition, and it was getting ready to open. And then suddenly he started to feel unwell. He had a sore throat, he was feeling really tired and really achy, and he was like, oh, I'm coming down with a cold. But over the next few days, his symptoms rapidly grew worse and worse and worse, to the point where he was in really significant pain, and he was so tired that he physically could not get out of bed. So his parents realized that something was more seriously wrong. So they took him to hospital, and after doing some tests, he was actually diagnosed with a form of acute leukemia. And his parents were told that not only was Carlo's condition incurable and terminal, but it was actually imminent that he was dying. He was going to die very quickly. He really didn't have much longer left. So it kind of came out of the blue for everyone. It was a big shock. Now, Carlo, when he received the news that he had a terminal diagnosis, he reacted by taking a deep breath, and then he said, well, the Lord wanted to wake me up. And from that moment onwards, he remained calm and serene. In fact, he was really cheerful. Apparently, he had a twinkle in his eye. He was trying to make other people laugh and smile. His main concern was making sure that his parents were okay because he knew that they were suffering. And he never complained, even though he was in incredible amounts of pain. At one point, one of the nurses asked him how he was going, and he was like, "Yeah, I'm doing okay. I'm doing pretty well." And she looked at him and she was like, "Are you sure? Because you're dying. Are you okay?" And he just shrugged and was like, "Well, there are plenty of people who are suffering more." And to be clear, at this point, Carlo was actually suffering a lot. He actually said to his parents that this was his purgatory. He said, "I'm going through purgatory right now, and I hope that I can go straight to heaven because of the pain that I'm going through right now." At one point, his dad asked him how he was going, and he looked at his dad and he said, "Dad, I am offering this up for the Pope and for the church." And later he said the same thing to his mum. He said, "Mum, I am giving my life for the church and for the Pope." So after many days of very intense suffering, Carlo eventually fell into a coma. He later had a brain hemorrhage and was declared brain dead. And on the morning of October the 12th, only 11 days after the original onset of symptoms, Carlo passed away. Now, despite the fact that Carlo's death was obviously very sudden, very tragic, very upsetting, there was a kind of supernatural joy surrounding his death because he had been so clearly close to God, so ready for death, so calm and accepting of it. And in fact, very quickly after his death, his impact on the world and the people around him became clear. Many of his friends came back to practicing the faith through him and even through going to his funeral. And almost immediately, people started sharing with Carlo's parents stories of favors that they had received from him. And within 6 years after his death, the cause was opened for his canonization. And actually, one of the potential problems that arose very quickly during the first stages of his cause for canonization was the fact that he was just so normal. At first, that almost seemed like a roadblock to canonizing him. It was like, was he that extraordinary? Was he that, he was just a normal teenage boy? But eventually, people realized that's precisely why he is so extraordinary. That is why his life is so special. That's why he needs to be held up as a model in the church, especially in the contemporary era. Because he wasn't, I've heard this phrase used in reference to him multiple times, he was extraordinary in his ordinariness. The fact that he was just an everyday teenager is such a witness to the vocation of every single one of us. We're not called to, some of us are called to go out and do extraordinary, amazing things, but most of us are called to just be normal, to eat Nutella in moderation, play the PlayStation with our friends and, build awesome websites. That is what we're all called to do, to find God in the everyday kind of circumstances of our lives. And actually, I want to end with a quote, something that Carlo himself used to often say. He used to say, "We are all born originals, but many of us die photocopies." Now, that saying can obviously be taken at a kind of surface level, be yourself. Don't be a carbon copy of the people around you. And it's actually very true. Don't just dress like the people around you and act like the people around you. Be yourself, be unique. But there is a deeper spiritual truth to that saying. When we think about it, sin makes us boring. Sin makes us carbon copies because the devil has a very limited playbook. He tempts us all with the same sins. The more sins we commit, the more we become like every other sinner out there. But the more holy we become, the more we become unique, the more we become ourselves. For Carlo, he became holy through his love of computers and playing soccer kind of not that well and having fun with his friends and loving animals. Every single one of us has a completely unique path to holiness and also personality and identity. And the holier we become, the more we become an original, the more we become the person that God specifically made us to be. And Carlo is an example of that, of what every single one of us is called to be an original, to be the saint that God has made us to be. And this is the final thing that I want to say. I just want to go back to those moments when Carlo was dying, when he said, "I am giving my life for the church and the Pope." Now, Carlo's mum often talks about this when she's giving talks about her son. She's like, Carlo knew that there were scandals in the church and that there were things that were rough and that were happening that were not good. There were people that were doing the wrong thing. And he reacted to that not by becoming bitter or losing his peace or gossiping or getting frustrated. He reacted by becoming a saint. He reacted by offering himself and his life for the sake of the church. And this is an example that we can all take away with us. Our job is to become saints. And that's actually the best way that we will help deal with the crises in the church and in the world. There's this great quote that I love from St. Josemaria Escriva where he says, "These crises of the world are crises of saints." In other words, we need more saints in the world. That's the number one thing that we need. So when we hear things that freak us out or that upset us or scandalize us, the first question we should ask is, okay, how am I trying to be a saint? How am I being holier? How am I praying for those people? How am I offering my life as a sacrifice? Because guess who else did that? Jesus. That's what he did. He offered himself and his suffering for the sake of sinners. And like Carlo, we should do the same. And of course, we don't literally have to die to do that. But however it happens, however we offer our prayer and our work and our suffering, our lives can become united to our Lord in the Holy Eucharist as an offering for the sake of the church, for the Pope, and for all souls. Okay, great. So in our next episode, we are actually going to dive into some Eucharistic miracles. We are going to use Carlo's website and we're going to use some other resources and we're going to talk about Eucharistic miracles across time in the Catholic Church. Can't wait. Awesome. Such fun. Have a great fortnight. I'll talk to you later. Okay, bye. Sacrament we thee adore. Oh, make us love thee more and more. Oh, make us love thee more and more. Hey friends, thanks for listening to this episode. If you are enjoying the podcast and you would like to see it continue and reach many more people, then I invite you to consider becoming a supporter on Patreon. There's a link to Patreon in the show notes of this episode. There are many running costs associated with running a podcast, and I rely 100% on the generosity of patrons. Thank you so much to those who already support the podcast. And most importantly, please continue to pray for me and for all of those who are listening.